Syria sanctions lifted. Caesar Act sanctions temporarily lifted for 180 days. Here is Jamal Thomas's take on the lifting of the sanctions. This is from Rumble, specifically from Sputnik, and the name of the show is Fault Lines.
The death toll from the earthquakes that struck Turkey and Syria on Monday, February 6th, has surpassed 21,000, officials said on Friday. Jeez. Rescue teams from several countries are currently aiding in both nations as they attempt to clear the destruction and rescue people from under the rubble. In a surprise move on Thursday, the U.S. Treasury said it is providing several months of sanction relief for Syria in order to allow transactions for recovery efforts. Oh, so the humanitarian thing came into play. You realize you're being sociopaths and making these people's lives demonstratively worse. It's appalling. Shouldn't have had to take multiple days for you to be a person. Let's keep going.
There we are. You know, I would do my time travel revelation to have us hear that again, but it's so succinct and upfront. I don't think we need to go any further with that idea. In complete U-turn, this is the cradle. In complete U-turn, U.S. issues temporary sanctions waiver to allow aid for Syria. U.S. officials and Western media have tried to portray sanctions as harmless, despite the fact that they've had a humanitarian, despite the impact that they've had on humanitarian assistance for Syria. Russian aid workers and Syrian government of Latakia, there in the pic. And the U.S. Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets, OFAC, on 10 February issued a temporary waiver for Caesar Act sanctions imposed on Syria to allow earthquake relief funds to reach the country following days of hindered humanitarian efforts. The Syria General License, GL-23, issued by OFAC, authorizes earthquake relief transactions, which would typically be restricted under the Syrian sanctions regulations for a period of 180 days. Our deepest condolences go out to the people of Turkey and Syria for the tragic loss of life and destruction in the wake of devastating earthquakes, Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Treasury Department Wally Adeyemo said. As international allies and humanitarian partners mobilize to help those affected, I want to make very clear that the U.S. sanctions in Syria will not stand in the way of life-saving efforts for the Syrian people, while U.S. sanctions programs already contain robust exemptions for humanitarian efforts today. Treasury is issuing a blanket general license to authorize earthquake relief efforts so that those providing assistance can focus on what's needed most, saving lives and rebuilding, he added. The decision followed a storm of criticism as many have called out the impact of U.S. sanctions on the humanitarian situation in the country, particularly on relief efforts following the devastating earthquake. Bassam Sabag, Syria's permanent UN envoy, said on 8 February that international cargo planes have been refusing to land in Syria airports due to the threat of sanctions. However, others have justified U.S. sanctions, claimed that they don't restrict humanitarian efforts or aid provision in any way, despite repeated UN warnings over the years and in the last few days following the disaster. However, many have pointed out that the sanctions are designed in a way that intimidates countries against dealing with the Syrian government, making it so that even when aid is involved, those who want to assist usually refrain from doing so due to the high risk of U.S. consequences. Senior U.S. officials have said in the last 2 days that they'll continue to refuse coordination with Damascus in any way, even going as far as calling it counterproductive. Washington claims to be working on the ground to provide aid through its NGO partners. However, even U.S.-based crowdfunding platform GoFundMe has canceled fundraising campaigns of local Syrians affected by the quake who are attempting to raise money for relief. The fact that the U.S. Treasury Department decided to officially issue a temporary waiver for the Caesar Act serves as proof that Washington's sanctions indeed do pose a threat to humanitarian efforts. Yes, so may get into it with another one of these stories, but there's a State Department official, Ned Price, who just 2 days ago unequivocally stated that the sanctions are not hindering Syria from receiving aid. And then I presume there was a turnaround. Hezbollah, this is from Press TV. Hezbollah downplays U.S. Syria sanctions waiver. Hezbollah downplays Washington's alleged temporary and partial waiver of its sanctions against Syria, which the U.S. has recently issued under the pretext of facilitating relief missions in the earthquake-stricken Arab country. The Lebanese Resistance Movement's Deputy Secretary Secretary General Sheikh Naim Qassem made the remarks in a tweet on Friday. The American administration, with its implementation of the Caesar sanctions and blockade of Syria and its people, is devoid of all humanitarian standards, the Hezbollah official wrote. Syria has been a target of U.S. sanctions since '79. The U.S. and its allies intensified their sanctions against the Arab people in 2011, after the nation found itself in the grip of rampant and hugely deadly foreign-backed violence. Strengthening the sanctions even further, the United States approved the Caesar Act in 2019, targeting any individual and business that participated either directly or indirectly in the Arab country's reconstruction efforts. Early on Friday, the U.S. Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control issued the waiver for the Caesar Act sanctions, allegedly authorizing earthquake relief transactions for a period of 6 months. The quake hit Turkey and neighboring, this idea, I think, that in 2019, the Caesar Act implemented that businesses that worked with Syria would be sanctioned as well. This is very interesting. And here's another one from Press TV. In wake of global criticism, U.S. temporary sanctions waiver for Syria. Washington's issued a temporary sanctions waiver to allow earthquake relief funds to reach Syria following widespread criticism that the bans are hampering international aid efforts in the country. The U.S. OFAC on Friday issued the waiver for Caesar Act sanctions imposed on Syria, authorizing earthquake relief transactions for a period of 6 months. Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Treasury Department, Wally Adeyemo, I think we got that quote. Yep, he authorized earthquake relief efforts so that those providing assistance can focus on what's needed most, saving lives and rebuilding. Syria has been a target of U.S. sanctions since 1979. Yep, we got that one. And the U.S. claims its sanctions have exemptions for humanitarian aid. However, experts say the sanctions intimidate countries against dealing with the Syrian government, and even when aid is involved, those who want to assist usually refrain from doing so due to the high risk of U.S. consequences. On Wednesday, Bassem Sabag, Syria's permanent UN envoy, said international cargo planes have been refusing to land in Syria. And earlier, the Syrian Foreign Ministry said in a statement that the sanctions prevent Syrians from importing rescue equipment. Other countries have criticized the bans, including China, which on Wednesday argued the U.S. To put aside its geopolitical obsession, or urged the U.S. to put aside its political or geopolitical obsession and remove its unilateral sanctions. Search and rescue operations continue in Syria. Death tolls at 22,000. The World Health Organization has urged the global community to lend a helping hand to Syria as the country's humanitarian needs are particularly high. The U.S. and its allies have ruled out the possibility of dealing directly with Syrian government in quake relief efforts. On Monday, State Department spokesman Ned Price said the U.S. will send aid to Syria through non-governmental organizations without engaging with the Syrian government. Yes, this concept of NGOs, we talked about that in relation to the Azerbaijani eco-activist situation. They are supported by NGOs, and this idea that the NGOs are not the government, it's kind of misleading because that's where they usually get their funds from. But maybe just that they don't, there's a facade that there's no political back and forth between a non-governmental entity and the entity that it's supporting. Okay, and from truthout.org, U.S. eases sanctions on Syria for earthquake relief. The 180-day sanctions relief came after U.S. officials denied that the restrictions would impact humanitarian aid. This is by Jake Johnson. In the face of mounting pressure from rights groups and relief organizations on the ground, the Biden administration on Thursday issued a temporary license authorizing all transactions related to the earthquake relief that would be otherwise prohibited by U.S. sanctions on Syria. The move announced by the Treasury Department on Thursday evening amounts to a tacit admission that U.S. sanctions could have impacted the delivery of humanitarian aid to the country following the massive earthquake and dozens of aftershocks that killed more than 21,000 people in Syria and neighboring Turkey. As international allies and humanitarian partners mobilize to help those affected, I want to make very clear that U.S. sanctions in Syria will not stand in the way of life-saving efforts of the Syrian people. And that's again Wali Adeyemo. And the sanctions relief, which will be in effect for 180 days, came after U.S. officials repeatedly denied that the restrictions would impact humanitarian aid. Earlier Thursday, U.S. State Department spokesman Ned Price said during a press briefing that there are many hurdles to overcome when providing humanitarian assistance in Syria, and especially after devastating earthquakes this week. But our Syrian sanctions policy is not among them.
Your inconsistencies are glaringly obvious. Your inconsistencies are glaringly obvious.
But reporting and accounts from humanitarian leaders indicate that the U.S. and European sanctions, which have long harmed Syrian civilians, despite ostensibly being targeted at the Assad government, have hampered early aid and recovery efforts, compounding existing difficulties surrounding the delivery of emergency supplies to rebel-held areas of Syria. Freezing weather has also complicated aid and rescue operations. So there we have it. There is our update on the Syria situation. I'm sure we'll have more, as we do here at TR. We're going to watch this space, and we'll be right back.